The Buddha's last meal. I thought it might be interesting today to talk about food, one of my favorite subjects as it happens, but it seems that I'm not the only one who is interested in this subject when it comes to Buddhism. It is quite interesting to note just how many monographs and articles and parts in books about the Buddha are about his last meal, what the Buddha's last meal was, which is really very interesting because nobody seems to be interested in his first meal or what he had directly after he was enlightened or anything like that. But everybody seems to be really interested in the Buddha's last meal. So I'd just like to share with you a few things I understand about this subject. So one thing we do know, because it is recorded in the Mahaparinirvana Sutta, which is the longest discourse in the Pali Tipitaka, is that on the last meal he had was given to him by a smith, a blacksmith, in a town called Pava, and it was, we know it was called Sukara Madhava. And exactly what this dish consisted of, we really don't know, but we can get perhaps some idea by the name. So the first part of Sukara Madhava, Sukara means a boar or a male pig, and Madhava means something like softness. So you could translate it as tender pork, which has been suggested as a suitable translation, and that would be quite okay. Now we come to the problem. What was the contents of that meal? And after many, many years by Buddhist scholars and scholars of Buddhism, the conclusion is, the most honest conclusion is, we simply don't know. So now some people mistakenly think that the Buddha was a vegetarian and he taught his disciples to be vegetarian. And when they see the name Sukara Madhava translated as something other than pork, they think that the Buddha was failing to practice what he himself taught, and Buddhists are trying to disguise the fact by changing the meaning of the name Sukara Madhava. The reality is the Buddha did not teach vegetarianism, and he wasn't a vegetarian. There are quite a few other places in the Tipitaka where it mentions the Buddha eating meat, being served a dish of meat and eating it. So on the other hand, there are other people who, scholars and Buddhists themselves, who think that the meal was actually consisted of, apart from other things, some sort of pork dish. So in actual fact, the reality is we really don't know what it was. But then the question could be asked then, if it was not significant, then why did the ancients, those who preserved the Tipitaka, bother to mention the name? Well, I suggest that perhaps one reason was because it was an unusual dish, whatever it was, or perhaps that it was very expensive, and the man who gave him that dish was clearly, as a blacksmith, he would have been a very poor person, that he went out of his way to give the Buddha a very fine meal. Maybe that was the reason why. So the next question we have to look at is, while it is certain that this was the Buddha's last meal, is it the thing that eventually led to his death some hours later? Is this the case? Well, once again, we really don't know, but my personal feeling is that this dish really had nothing to do with the Buddha's passing, and I'll give you my reasons why. We know that some months before the Buddha arrived in Pava, he had been extremely ill. He suffered from a complaint which made him very, very ill and weak. We also know that he was about 80 years old at that time. And we also know that he had just completed a long walk from Rajagaha to Vaishali, which was certainly over 100 kilometers. So for a man who was already old and weak, this must have been quite trying for him. And then having this sickness fall upon him, this must have weakened him further. After the rainy season, he departed with a group of monks, including Ananda, and they continued on their journey northwest towards Kushinara. Before they got to Kushinara, they had obviously stopped for every day, or perhaps several times during the day, for the Buddha to rest. And during that time, it is very likely that he had other meals, and in particular, it's very likely that he rehydrated, that he drank water. So I suggest that given the symptoms that the Buddha exhibited after he had eaten his meal of sukara madhava, that he suffered from, as it is described in the Tipitaka, diarrhea with blood. Sounds very unpleasant. Now, it seems to me that it's very likely what the Buddha was suffering from was gastroenteritis. Now, people are funny. If you eat a meal and you become very sick half an hour later or an hour later, you automatically assume that what you just ate caused the stomach trouble and the bowel trouble. But that's not the case. We know that in the case of gastroenteritis, after you drink or eat the contaminated food or water, you may not get the symptoms for a day, or sometimes for 2 days, or sometimes even for 3 days. So my contention is that the Buddha may very well have drunk contaminated water a day or 2 days or even 3 days before he suffered from diarrhea with blood. It just so happened that this was just after he'd eaten his last meal, but that does not mean that the last meal was the one that eventually led to his passing. So that's my theory on the subject. Now we know that after this sickness, the Buddha and his companions continued on their journey. They arrived in Kushinara. The Buddha lay down between 2 sal trees and eventually passed away. So the theory is, again, that because of this last meal, the Buddha becoming very sick after this last meal, that was the thing that led to his death. Once again, I have a different theory. I think the thing that led to the Buddha's death was what leads to a lot of people's death. That is, he was simply old. So here we have a man who was 80 years old. He had just come to the completion of a very long journey by foot in the height of summer, that he had been sick in Vaishali about a month or 2 beforehand. Then he got gastroenteritis. This weakened him, and as a weak, old, and probably very tired man, this is what eventually killed the Buddha. So these are just some thoughts I have got on the Buddha's last meal. If you disagree with me, and you may very well, at least some of the things I said may encourage you to think a little deeper on this subject.